Today we're diving into the best games that you can play on the M1 MacBook Air, taking it all the way back to where it first began. This channel actually took off when I unboxed the very first Apple Silicon Mac with the M1 chip nearly 4 years ago. And since then, I've been showcasing just how well Mac gaming has evolved and improved. So in this video, I'll be sharing my 19 game recommendations that run smoothly even on the M1 MacBook Air, the lowest end M chip series Mac that you can get. And the types of games that you can play on this machine are very much limited by the 8GB of RAM of the base model, which rules out many of the bigger titles. And because the MacBook Air has no fans and is completely passively cooled, I'll also be talking a little bit about thermal throttling and performance too. So today's list of games features a mix of everything: AAA optimized games, lightweight casual indie titles, powerful console emulation, and even big Windows games played through translation layers. And the best part is that even if you have a newer M2, M3 or M4 Mac, then these games will run even better on that hardware as long as your Mac is clear of any junk. And that brings us to today's sponsor, Clean My Mac. And if you didn't already know, Clean My Mac is the ultimate tool to optimize, clean, and speed up your Mac. With just a single click of the Smart Care button, the app will scan for junk files, duplicates, and even malware, and remove them instantly. My favorite feature is the Cleanup tool, which clears out unnecessary files like user caches created by crossover, leftover Xcode junk, and even Intel x86 binaries from Universal Apps. This leaves you with just the native ARM applications and frees up precious space on your Mac's solid-state drive. And for even more storage savings, the My Clutter feature gets rid of large duplicate files, photos, and downloads that you don't need. Clean My Mac can also automatically scan for updates of all of your apps, not just from the App Store, but also third-party game launchers and emulators like Prism, PlayCover, and even 14 on Mac. And with a sleek new design, Clean My Mac lets you get quick access to everything happening with your Mac in its menu app dashboard, including memory usage, disk space, network traffic, and CPU performance. Clean My Mac is available for purchase on the MacPaw website, the Mac App Store, and Set app. Check out the link in the description for a 7-day free trial. So the first game on the list is Death Stranding, which is definitely one of the most well-optimized games for the Apple Silicon Mac, and it performs excellently on the base M1 MacBook Air. Here we're looking at the different graphical presets between low, medium, default, and very high. And personally, I think the game looks amazing even at 1080p at low graphic settings. And this is really made possible by Apple's upscaling technology called Metal FX, which uplifts the base performance of about 25 FPS to allowing it to run at a very respectable 40 to 55 FPS with the Metal FX performance mode turned on. And even though the upscaling can look quite aggressive on a larger screen, when played on something like the MacBook Air's smaller display, it still manages to look amazing. Here I am playing with a Bluetooth wireless controller. And also what's really nice is that DualSense haptic feedback is supported, one of the only games to do so on the Apple Silicon Mac. And a lot of people ask what the thermal performance is like on a fanless MacBook Air. And that's because when you play a game on a high-end machine like this, temperatures can reach fairly high levels. And the fanless MacBook Air will throttle itself and reduce performance until temperatures come under control. However, despite running the game at nearly an hour, outside temperatures aren't too hot to touch, and this is a testament to how well Death Stranding is optimized for the Mac, being one of the most graphically beautiful games being played on very modest Mac hardware. So next up, we are looking at another well-optimized Apple Silicon port, Resident Evil 4. So if you're not familiar with this is the Resident Evil 4 remake, which got a natively optimized Apple Silicon port late last year. Again, like Death Stranding, this is an absolutely excellent port that is graphically quite intense, but manages to work pretty well on base M1 Apple Silicon hardware. Now, to get good frame rates, what I've had to do is turn on Metal FX to performance mode in order to use the upscaling technology, and consequently things look a little bit blurry. However, the game looks good enough playing on the MacBook Air screen, and we're able to play at a good enough frame rate of about 40 to 55 FPS at this graphic setting. And the next game that we're looking at is No Man's Sky. So this game originally came out on PlayStation 4 and Windows back in 2016, and it's been continually updated with new content and features over the years, finally receiving its optimized macOS port in June last year. So here we're running at 1080p at standard performance with Metal FX turned onto performance mode, which means it's being upscaled. However, the game still looks really good, and as a bonus, we are running at over 100 FPS in space. And as we transition from space onto a planet, this is where the FPS dips the most. We're getting about 40 FPS here, but as the game actually loads, frame rate pops up to about 60 or 70 FPS actually on the planet. Anyway, this is a great game with tons of content to play on the base M1 MacBook Air. Definitely make sure to check this one out. Next up, we are playing the game Balatro. So this is probably one of my favorite games of the year. So if you haven't heard of this already, this is a roguelike game based on poker hands. And basically the idea is to score as many points as possible using a combination of the hands that you're given, as well as jokers, tarot cards, and planet cards. The fact that it's a roguelike means that many of the elements are randomized on every game, and it basically has near infinite replayability. So presentation as a MacBook game is pretty basic. It's a 2D game, but obviously it's ideal for a low-end MacBook as there are basically no system requirements, and it's absolutely perfect for really long game sessions as you can really extend the battery on your MacBook Air playing this game. Next up, we're looking at Hades 2 Early Access. So this has been out for a few months on the Windows side, and it's just had its macOS Early Access release. So obviously this is not the finalized game, however, it is pretty functional on macOS. Again, this is a roguelike game, so elements change on every single playthrough, and there are tons of weapons, skills, and a lot of replayability as well. And you can earn persistent upgrades that carry you through to the next run. And despite being a very new game, it has very low system requirements, running perfectly at 1080p at 60 frames per second, and an absolutely ideal game for the M1 MacBook Air. So the next game we're looking at is Metro Exodus. So this AAA first-person shooter first came out in 2019 and got its macOS port in 2021. This is actually an Intel x86 binary running through Rosetta 2, is one of the only ones on this list of games. Nevertheless, the bottleneck is really on the number of GPU cores on the MacBook Air. And running this at 1080p on the low graphics preset, we're able to achieve frame rates roughly between 40 and 60 to 70 FPS. Anyway, make sure to try this out. It's one of the few big budget AAA first-person shooter campaigns on the Mac. So next we're looking at Celeste, the brutally difficult platforming game. So the platforming mechanics are quite a challenge to get to grips with, and they also take time to master as well, but thankfully every time you die you can restart pretty much instantaneously, memorizing the sequences required for each level, and slowly making progress through this enormous game. And one thing I like about this game is the fact that you can use a controller with a specific SDL fix, however it's perfectly playable using the MacBook Air keyboard, making this a really easy game to pick up and go. So next up we are looking at the cat puzzle game Stray. So here I'm running the game at 1080p low with resolution scale set to 50%. If you do try to run this at 100% resolution scale, it's going to stutter quite a lot, not really playable unless we bump it down to 50%. During actual gameplay we're running about 55 to 60 FPS. I have VSync turned on here so it's actually capped to 60 frames, but it manages to play very fluidly. And that's because it's been natively optimized for the Apple Silicon chip, offering decent efficiency and frame rates. So next up is Hollow Knight. So this is a modern 2D side-scrolling Metroidvania action platforming game. You play as the character called the Knight, an insectoid warrior exploring Hollow Nest, a world plagued by a supernatural disease. So yes, this is another low-end 2D action platformer type game. Also, I think the keyboard controls for this are fairly decent, and the game runs at a solid 60 FPS on the MacBook Air, which is great because this game demands precision and timing. Hollow Knight often makes it to the #1 of all-time very best Metroidvania games, so make sure to check this out on the Mac. Next up, we're looking at the game Minecraft. So here we're playing the Java edition of this game through something called the Prism Launcher. If you install it correctly, then this will be running natively using the ARM64 version of Java, which allows Minecraft to run at crazy high frame rates. If you want to find out how to do this, then make sure to click on the link in the description for my Prism Minecraft tutorial. So here we're running at 1080p with a render distance of 20 and a simulation and shadow distance of 12, and we're getting about 150 to 250 FPS. Here we're trying out the complementary shaders set at low, and we're only getting about 45 to 50 FPS, but the game looks dramatically better. There's a huge increase in visual quality, and it's taxing our 8 GPU cores a hell of a lot more than before. So anyway, Minecraft on the Mac is infinitely customizable with mods and shader packs and can easily run very well on the MacBook Air. So the next game on the list is Grid Legends, the criminally underrated racing game. And in order to get a playable frame rate on the M1 MacBook Air, I've bumped this down to 720p. I put this onto the ultra low preset, and I've also turned Metal FX onto quality mode. Now this does compromise the image quality of course, but we are able to achieve pretty good frame rates, everything from about 60 to 90 FPS. So this game features a much more story and narrative focused career mode, inspired by the Formula One Netflix show Drive to Survive, and it's well worth checking out as one of the few recently released AAA titles. This was initially released in 2022 and got its Mac port in late 2023. Next we are looking at Valheim, the survival sandbox game which is still in early access. So this recently got a Mac port as well, and it's remarkably well optimized for the Mac. One cool thing about this game is the fact that it's very lightweight. It only uses up about 2.8 gigabytes of storage, so well worth keeping on the internal solid state drive of your MacBook Air. And it's also a very pretty game despite the fact that we've turned down the settings quite substantially. Here we're running at 1080p with the graphics mode set to performance. And we also have rendering scale set to 70%. And here we're running about 40 to 60 FPS in this early part of the game, which isn't necessarily indicative of what it's like to play in late game, but you could always reduce the performance even further if you wanted to. The game still looks great. So next we are looking at Stardew Valley, the 2016 farm life simulation RPG, which has a lot of similarities to another series called Harvest Moon, and is one of the best-selling indie games of all time. In this game, you're basically tasked with renovating this farm, clearing boulders, trees, stumps, and weeds, and then make way for crops, buildings, and other placeable items on the game world. And obviously, due to the fact that this is a fully 2D game, it's very low-end and lightweight, and it's very much a calm and cozy casual experience, and easily playable on the M1 MacBook Air. So next up, we're looking at the life simulation game The Sims 4. So this game is a pretty big one in the series. It is over 10 years old at this point, but it has an excellent Mac port. It also recently received a native ARM binary, making it run much more efficiently on Apple Silicon Macs. Now, if you've never played The Sims before, it's a pretty basic life simulator. You can create a sim in your own image if you want to. They can get a job, buy a house, make friends, form relationships, and there's tons of content to try out, including huge quantities of expansion packs and DLC. Anyway, it's cool to see that big games like this are still getting updated and supported on Apple Silicon hardware. Next up, we are looking at the game Tunic. So this is a beautiful action-adventure game in the vein of Zelda. This is set in the ruins of a post-apocalyptic fantasy world, and you play as an anthropomorphic fox navigating the terrain and fighting off hostile creatures. And this game is definitely a gem in the Mac gaming ecosystem, so make sure to check this one out. Next, we are looking at the game Red Dead Redemption 1. So yes, there is a Windows port coming out in the near future. It's unknown whether this is going to work through translation layers on a Mac. However, in the meantime, you can play the Nintendo Switch version using the emulator Ryujinx very well on the Apple Silicon Mac. This is the emulator Ryujinx, which you might have heard recently got taken down. However, it's still very much possible to find the old binaries floating around the internet, and even though it's no longer being updated, it still plays games like Red Dead Redemption very well. And that's thanks to the fact that we're actually using the hypervisor to virtualize the Nintendo Switch, not emulate it, and it means that we can get pretty decent performance at about 30-35 FPS on Red Dead Redemption 1 with VSync turned off, running in handheld mode. So in the near future, I'm going to do my very final Ryujinx tutorial on how to get this working. And it's not just Red Dead Redemption that you can play. Virtually the entire Nintendo Switch console library can be played on the M1 Apple Silicon Mac. So make sure not to sleep on this emulator, it's still really good. Next, we are looking at Grand Theft Auto 5. So this is the Windows version of the game being played through a translation layer called Crossover using D3D Metal from Game Porting Toolkit. So GTA 5 is one of the best optimized games that you can actually play on the Mac, and it runs great through Crossover. However, just be aware that it's only the single player that can be run through Crossover. Ever since GTA Online introduced the Battle Eye anti-cheat, then the game can't be run through the wine translation layer, which Crossover relies on. However, it is possible to play GTA Online using a virtual machine software called Parallels and the latest version of Windows 11 on Canary. However, the M1 MacBook Air isn't really powerful to run online multiplayer, I'm afraid. However, single player performance is very decent, especially for a passively cooled Mac like this, considering that we're running through these triple translation layers, x86 to ARM64, Windows to macOS, and DirectX to Metal using D3D Metal. So there is a lot of performance lost to all of these overheads, but we're still managing to run at about 50 FPS at 1080p on kind of default low settings. Anyway, if you want to find out how to do this, then make sure to click on the link in the description for my crossover tutorial and discount code. Next, we're looking at the game Overwatch 2. Again, we are playing a Windows game through the crossover translation layer, and it manages to work surprisingly well even on the base M1. So here we're playing at 1080p on low settings at the 50% resolution scale, and this is enough to get us playing online with real people competitively, running at about 60 to 70 FPS, which isn't too bad. Yes, it is running through this translation layer, and we are losing a lot of performance because of that. However, Overwatch 2 is one of the very few competitive multiplayer games that actually works on Apple Silicon hardware, so it's worth going through the trouble of setting this up for your Mac. Lastly, we're looking at the game Dragon Ball Sparking Zero. So this is a Windows game that's been fairly recently released, and I wanted to put this here because I want to show that the M1 MacBook Air is still capable of playing even the newest Windows games, as long as there are some concessions and you can turn down the performance settings to get this playable on the base M1 chip. To make this playable, I've really turned down the resolution scale down to 50%, and you also have to wait for animations to cache correctly. So the first time you do an attack, it's going to stutter very heavily, and then the second time you perform the attack, it'll be smoother. However, it'll still be a little bit stuttery. This is just the reality of Windows gaming on the Mac at the moment. So right now, if you do play this game on a Mac, you are limited to the single player, but hopefully that's something that's going to be fixed in the future. Anyway, those were my games listed for the M1 Apple Silicon Mac. Let me know in the comments if you think any other game deserves to be on this list. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.